What constitutes a trend? This is a very important question and a very valuable skill to develop. For example, here we have some data. With the benefit of hindsight, in other words, with the data that we see here, it's easy to conclude that we have, although a cyclical, but overall positive sloping trend. However, what if we don't have that much data? Any monkey can see a trend after there's perhaps 15 or 20 or more data points. It also depends on how much data that we have. For example, if we only have the data shown in the yellow box highlighted, we would conclude that the overall trend is positive, sloping upward more steeply than the overall trend seen, and we would have no information about the cyclical trend superimposed on top. Further, if we had only this amount of data shown in the highlighted yellow box, we would conclude that there is an overall negative sloping or downward trend, which once again, compared to what we know about the overall picture, would be totally wrong. If we looked at a different set of data, a little bit more data, once again, we would conclude that there is an overall positive or upward sloped trend, and we would start to get some information perhaps about the cyclical nature of the trend. But compared to what we have in the big picture, as shown in the entire white box, once again, we would be missing much of the information. And so on and so on. So one of the lessons here is that the trend that we conclude based on the data alone is only as valid as the data that we have. That is a very significant limitation, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But more importantly, what if we have only a very small amount of data available? What if there are only 3 data points, or 2 data points, or 1 data point? Is it possible to see a trend with only a single data point? Or, better yet, is it possible to see a trend with absolutely no data whatsoever? Most people would argue that it would be impossible to see a trend with just a few data points or 1 data point, and it would certainly be impossible to see a trend with absolutely no data points. However, I would argue that is not in fact the case. We can see a trend with a very small number of data points, or indeed no data whatsoever. We have to look a little differently. In other words, we have to look beyond the data. So any monkey can see a trend after there are perhaps 15 or 20 or even more data points. The challenge is, how do we see a trend when there is just a small number of data, or 1 data point, or no data points whatsoever? On a personal note, many companies pay me a lot of money to come in and help them figure out where to invest their R&D dollars today, such that in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, and so on, they'll be in the right place. Suffice it to say, if I only came in with a stack of printouts that I generated from Medline, I would never get invited to come back a second time. The challenge here is to be able to see things before most other people see them. That is a very important skill to develop. Although we have to keep in mind, as Arthur Schopenhauer said, the German philosopher, every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. We have to be aware of our own limits in our own field of vision so that we can see past them. Can we ever see the whole picture? In other words, even in the white box above, that might not in fact be the entire picture. If we looked at an even greater amount of data, we might come to yet a different conclusion as well. Bottom line, many people say that we only can make decisions based on the data that we have, which is true, but we have to be aware of the data that we don't have as well. In other words, discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. it's very easy to look at the data that we see and try to make conclusions or interpretations based on that data. The question is, how do we include the data that we don't see, and why do we not see it, and how do we adjust our interpretations accordingly? Once again, that is a difficult but very important and very valuable skill to develop, not just in your academic career, but most importantly in your industrial career.